The steel hull of the Abyssal Voyager creaked as it bobbed gently on the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Dr. Emily Lawson stood on the deck, staring out at the endless horizon. The water around them was eerily calm, its surface reflecting the leaden sky above. It was as if the ocean itself was holding its breath, waiting. Emily's eyes were distant, focused on a point far beyond the visible. She felt the familiar weight of the locket around her neck, the one she had worn since her father's disappearance 5 years ago. He had been on an expedition much like this one, his final transmission a garbled mess of static and desperate whispers. They never found his submersible. They never found anything at all. Dr. Lawson, a voice pulled her back to the present. Captain Jack Holloway stood beside her, his weathered face showing a mixture of concern and determination. "It's time." Emily nodded, her fingers instinctively clutching the locket. "Let's do this." The crew gathered in the control room, the heart of the Abyssal Voyager. Mark, the young sonar technician, was already at his station, his fingers dancing over the controls. His face was alight with excitement. "All systems are green," he reported. "We're ready for descent." Dr. Sofia Hernandez, the marine geologist, adjusted her glasses and looked at Emily with a mixture of skepticism and unease. "Are we really prepared for this? The Mariana Trench is unpredictable." Emily forced a smile, masking the gnawing dread that threatened to rise within her. "That's why we're here, Sophia, to explore the unknown," Captain Holloway grunted. "There are some things better left unexplored," he muttered, casting a wary glance at the deep. He had spent a lifetime on the sea and had heard every sailor's tale imaginable. Legends of ancient beings that slumbered beneath the waves, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Ignoring the captain's comment, Emily took her seat and fastened the harness. The others followed suit. With a final nod, she gave the command, "Initiate descent." The hum of the engines filled the control room as the submersible began its slow descent into the trench. The surface light faded rapidly, replaced by a dim, bluish glow. The deeper they went, the darker it became. Emily watched the depths swallow the vessel, the pressure gauge steadily climbing. Outside, the world transformed into an abyssal void. "Depth at 2,000 meters, Mark announced. His voice wavered slightly, betraying the nerves that gripped them all. The glass window showed nothing but the inky blackness of the deep ocean. Occasionally, faint glimmers would appear, bioluminescent creatures darting past, their ghostly forms illuminating the darkness for mere moments. Sophia leaned closer to her monitor, analyzing the data from the sonar. "I'm picking up some unusual geological formations below us," she said, frowning. "It's almost artificial." "Artificial?" Captain Holloway shot her a glance. "Like ruins?" Sophia shook her head. "No, it's more like patterns. Regular shapes that don't occur naturally at this depth." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Patterns. The word conjured images of ancient civilizations and forgotten rituals. She pushed the thought aside. They were scientists, not storytellers. "Keep an eye on it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As they descended further, the temperature inside the submersible dropped noticeably. Emily rubbed her hands together, trying to warm them. "Is the heating system malfunctioning?" she asked. Mark checked the controls. "No, everything's functioning normally. It just seems colder than it should be." They continued their descent in silence, the atmosphere growing heavier with each passing meter. The pressure gauge climbed higher, the numbers a constant reminder of the ocean's crushing grip. Outside, the blackness seemed to press against the submersible, a tangible presence that threatened to engulf them. "Depth at 6,000 meters, Mark's voice broke the silence. "We're approaching the target area." Suddenly, the submersible shuddered violently. Alarms blared and the lights flickered. The crew was thrown against their harnesses as the vessel tilted, groaning as if some giant hand had seized it. "What the hell was that?" Captain Holloway shouted, gripping the console. Mark's fingers flew over the controls. "I don't know. We're not picking up any physical objects on the sonar." Emily strained to see outside, but the darkness was impenetrable. Then, just on the edge of their light, something moved. A shadow, massive and formless, glided past the submersible, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was there one moment and gone the next, a fleeting glimpse of something that defied explanation. "Did you see that?" Sophia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "See what?" Captain Holloway demanded, his voice tight. Mark was pale, his hands shaking. It looked like a shipwreck. But not just any shipwreck. It looked ancient, and there was something wrong about it. Emily felt her heart race. This was it. The anomaly, the unknown. She forced herself to stay calm. "We need to go deeper." Captain Holloway turned to her, his eyes blazing with anger. "Are you insane? We need to surface and report this." "No," Emily said firmly. "We came here for answers. We're not turning back now." Sophia hesitated, looking between the captain and Emily. I agree with Emily. If we turn back now, we'll never know what we saw." Captain Holloway cursed under his breath but didn't argue further. The submersible steadied, and they continued their descent. "Depth at 9,000 meters, Mark reported, his voice strained. "We're almost at the bottom." The submersible's lights illuminated the seabed, revealing a landscape of jagged rocks and strange formations. In the distance, they saw it. The shipwreck. It lay half buried in the silt, its hull covered in grotesque coral that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the wreck. The carvings on the hull became clearer, twisted images of sea creatures and human faces distorted in agony. It was as if the ship itself was screaming, a silent cry that echoed in the minds of those who gazed upon it. "There's something inside the wreck," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm picking up a signal." "A signal?" Sophia leaned forward, her eyes wide. "That's impossible." Emily felt a surge of adrenaline. This was what they had come for, the mystery, the truth. "Prepare the ROV," she ordered. "We're going in." As the remotely operated vehicle, ROV, was deployed, the crew watched in tense silence. The ROV moved toward the wreck, its camera feed displayed on the monitor. They saw the twisted metal, the gaping holes in the hull, and the darkness beyond. Then the ROV's camera flickered. The screen went black. "What the—" Mark frantically adjusted the controls, but the feed remained dark. A crackling sound filled the control room, a faint whisper that grew louder. Emily's blood turned to ice as she heard it. Her name, repeated over and over, distorted and alien. "Emily. Emily ... She stared at the monitor, her hands trembling. The darkness on the screen seemed to pulse, a living void that reached out toward them. "Emily, join us." The whispering grew, a chorus of voices that filled the submersible with a chilling dread. The lights flickered again, and the temperature dropped further. Frost formed on the glass, and the submersible groaned as if under the weight of an unseen force. Emily tore her eyes away from the screen, her mind reeling. They had ventured into the abyss, and now the abyss was staring back. "Initiate emergency ascent," Captain Holloway shouted, his voice slicing through the chaos. Mark's hands moved to comply, but it was too late. The submersible shuddered violently, and the lights went out. They were plunged into absolute darkness, the whispers now a deafening roar. In the darkness, Emily felt the presence around them closing in. They were trapped in the abyss, and something was coming for them. Something ancient, something hungry. The darkness inside the Abyssal Voyager was thick and oppressive, a living entity that pressed against the crew's minds. Emily fought against the rising tide of panic. Her breath was shallow, each inhalation seeming to draw the cold air of the abyss deeper into her lungs. The submersible's lights remained dead, leaving them blind to the world outside. Only the emergency red glow of the control panel offered a grim illumination, painting their faces in shades of blood. "What's happening?" Sophia's voice was tight, bordering on hysteria. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the dark void beyond the windows. "We lost power," Mark replied, his voice trembling. His fingers worked feverishly over the controls. "Backup systems should have kicked in by now, but nothing." Captain Holloway's jaw was set in a grim line. "We need to surface. We're sitting ducks down here." Emily knew he was right, but something inside her resisted. They had come so far. The signal, the shipwreck, it was as if they had stumbled upon a part of the ocean that didn't want to be disturbed, and it was fighting back. "We have to understand what's happening here," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We can't leave yet." Holloway glared at her. "You saw what happened. We're not equipped to handle this. This isn't some science experiment gone wrong. Something's down here and it doesn't want us here." The words hung in the air, sinking into their bones. They all felt it, an encroaching presence that seemed to press against the submersible's hull, testing its strength. The whispers had faded, but they lingered in the back of their minds, an ever-present hum that made the silence unbearable. Then, as if in response to their fear, the lights flickered back on. Mark jumped back, startled, as the screens flared to life. The sonar emitted a series of rapid pings, signaling movement outside. He stared at the monitor, his face drained of color. Something's moving out there. Sophia and Emily leaned in, their eyes locked on the screen. At first, it was a blur, an amorphous shape drifting through the water. But as the submersible's floodlights swung toward it, the shape coalesced into something familiar yet entirely alien. A figure, humanoid but twisted, covered in the same grotesque coral as the shipwreck. Its face was a mask of agony, frozen in a scream that sent a jolt of horror through them all. "Oh my God!" Sophia gasped, recoiling. "What is that?" The figure drifted closer, its eyes lifeless but aware, following the submersible as if it could see them, sense them. Emily felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. It was impossible, but the figure looked human. Or at least, it once had been. "It's one of the crew from the wreck," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "It has to be." The figure's mouth moved, opening and closing in a slow, deliberate motion. For a heart-stopping moment, Emily thought she could hear the voice again. Her name echoed in the deep. "Emily, join us." "No!" She recoiled, pressing her hands to her ears. It was inside her head, a voice not of sound but of thought. It spoke in fragments, disjointed and chaotic, threading into the gaps of her consciousness. "Emily, what is it?" Holloway's voice was distant, like he was speaking from the end of a long tunnel. She forced herself to focus, to push back against the intrusion. "We need to move," she managed, her voice strained. "Get us away from that thing." Mark scrambled to comply, diverting the thrusters to push the submersible away from the figure. As they moved, the humanoid form drifted out of sight, swallowed once more by the darkness. But the whispers persisted, a constant droning hum that filled the silence. The submersible jolted suddenly, throwing them forward. Mark cursed as he tried to stabilize their course. "Something's got us." On the external cameras, they saw it, a tendril of dark, sinewy matter snaking its way around the submersible. It was like a limb of the abyss itself, writhing and pulsing with a life of its own. More tendrils followed, wrapping around them, pulling them downward. "We're being dragged," Holloway shouted, his hands gripping the controls. "Full reverse." Mark pushed the thrusters to maximum. But it was useless. The tendrils held fast, dragging them deeper into the trench. Outside, the darkness seemed to throb, a malevolent force that closed in around them. Sophia's eyes were fixed on the sonar. "There's a cave," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "We're being pulled into a cave." Emily's heart pounded. This was what they had seen on the sonar before. The anomaly. The unnatural patterns that had appeared like shadows on the screen. They were being drawn into its heart. "Brace for impact," Holloway yelled as the submersible lurched forward, plunging into the cave. The walls of the cavern loomed on the monitors, jagged and unnatural, lined with the same coral-like substance that had covered the shipwreck. The submersible scraped against the rocky surface, sparks flying as metal met stone. Then, with a final jolt, they came to a halt. Silence. Emily blinked, her vision blurred. Blood trickled down her forehead from where she had struck the console. Around her, the crew stirred, groaning and disoriented. The emergency lights flickered, casting an ominous red glow throughout the cabin. We're inside," Mark stammered, checking the instruments with shaking hands. "We're inside the cave." Sophia stared at the screen, her face pale. "The signal, it's coming from here, from inside." The sonar showed the cavern's interior, a vast hollow expanse that extended far beyond the reach of their lights. Strange formations jutted from the walls, organic yet mechanical, pulsating with a faint luminescence. In the center, a mass of darkness swirled, a void that seemed to swallow the light around it. "It's alive," Sophia breathed, her eyes wide with terror. "The cave, it's alive." Emily felt the whispers again, stronger now. They filled her mind, words in a language she couldn't understand yet felt in her bones. They spoke of hunger, of eons of confinement, of an ancient will that demanded to be free. "We need to get out of here," Holloway said, his voice taut with urgency. "We're not prepared for this." Mark shook his head. "The thrusters are offline. We're not going anywhere." The submersible shuddered, a deep rumble reverberating through the cavern. Outside, the mass of darkness shifted, tendrils reaching out, probing the vessel. Emily stared at the monitor, her stomach twisting in horror. Then something appeared on the screen, a figure moving through the darkness toward them. It was human, unmistakably so, clad in a deep-sea suit. But its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, as if it were being manipulated like a puppet. The figure reached the submersible's viewport, its face obscured by the helmet. Slowly it raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. And then, through the murky visor, Emily saw it. Her father's face. "No," she gasped, stumbling back. "That's impossible. He's dead." "Emily." The voice was inside her head again, clearer now, more insistent. "You must listen." The figure on the screen began to change, the suit dissolving into the shadows, its features warping into a grotesque amalgamation of faces. Her father's face twisted and merged with others, men, women, all screaming silently, their eyes wide with fear and agony. "They're the crew," Sophia whispered. "The crew of the shipwreck. They're trapped down here." Emily felt a wave of nausea. The abyss was not just a place. It was a prison, a maw that consumed all who ventured too close. And now it was pulling them in, drawing them toward the center of its darkness. "We have to fight it," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't let it take us." But even as she spoke, the submersible groaned under the pressure. The tendrils tightened, constricting, squeezing the vessel like a predator crushing its prey. The darkness beyond the viewport pulsed, a rhythmic throb that matched the beating of her heart. Emily looked at her crew, at the fear in their eyes, and knew that their fate hung by a thread. The abyss whispered to her, promising knowledge, power, and the answer she had sought for so long. It beckoned her to give in, to surrender to its embrace. But she could not. Not yet. We need to disrupt the signal, she said, her voice hardening with resolve. It's using it to manipulate us. Sophia nodded, though her hands shook as she moved to the controls. I'll try to create an interference. Mark monitored the screens, his eyes darting between the shifting mass outside and the readouts that flashed with warnings. Hurry, he urged, his voice cracking under the strain. Sophia worked quickly, her fingers a blur over the controls. The submersible's systems hummed as she rerouted power, generating a burst of energy meant to scramble the signal emanating from the cavern. The effect was immediate. The darkness recoiled, the tendrils twitching and withdrawing slightly. The whispers in Emily's mind faded, replaced by a roar of anger that shook the submersible. For a brief moment, the crew felt the grip around them loosen. It's working, Mark shouted, hope flaring in his eyes. But then the abyss retaliated. The cavern walls shuddered, and the mass at the center surged forward, tendrils flailing with renewed fury. They lashed against the submersible, a violent onslaught that threatened to tear it apart. Emily gritted her teeth, holding onto the console as the vessel rocked violently. Sophia, keep it up. Sophia nodded, but Emily could see the strain in her eyes. The submersible's systems were overloading, warning lights flashing as power levels fluctuated. They were fighting against a force beyond their understanding, a will that had waited eons for freedom. Emily, the voice whispered again, a final plea. Free. Us. Emily looked at the screen, at the faces trapped within the abyss, and felt a wave of sorrow. They were victims, just as they were now, caught in a web of ancient power that twisted and consumed. Not today, she whispered back, her voice filled with defiance. The submersible jolted as Sophia unleashed another wave of interference, the pulse stronger this time. The tendrils shrieked, retreating into the shadows. The darkness writhed, a mass of rage and despair, before it began to dissolve, retreating into the depths of the cavern. Silence fell. The cavern was still, the oppressive presence lifting. The submersible, battered but intact, floated in the darkness, free from the abyss's grip. Emily slumped in her seat, her body trembling with exhaustion. They had survived. For now. We need to surface, Holloway said, his voice hoarse, before it comes back. Emily nodded. Agreed. As they prepared for ascent, Emily cast one last look at the darkness beyond the viewport. It was still there, lurking, waiting. They had pushed it back, but it was not defeated. The whispers would return. They always did. And as the abyssal voyager began its slow climb toward the surface, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had only glimpsed the beginning of something far more terrifying. The abyss had awakened, and it would not rest until it had claimed what it desired, her. The journey had just begun. A hollow, oppressive silence filled the abyssal voyager as it continued to drift within the cavern, shrouded in the ancient darkness of the trench. Emily stared into the void beyond the viewport, her mind reeling from the revelations that had unfolded. The faint, luminescent glow from the cavern walls cast eerie shadows inside the submersible, making everything feel more surreal and twisted. We need to surface, Captain Holloway said again, his voice a growl of urgency. He had already said this a dozen times, but they all knew it wasn't that simple. Something was holding them here, an unseen force that refused to let go. The thrusters are operational, Mark muttered, his eyes glued to the controls. But something's jamming the propulsion systems. We're stuck. Emily clenched her fists, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. They were deep within the abyss, surrounded by a malevolent force that had been waiting for them. Her mind flashed back to the figure, her father's face contorted and screaming within the shadows. Emily, Sophia's voice cut through the silence. She was staring at the screen, her face pale. Look at this. Emily moved to her side, her eyes scanning the data on the screen. The signal from the cavern was still active, pulsing with an almost rhythmic cadence. It was like a heartbeat, steady, deliberate, alive. But now it was changing, evolving into a new pattern. A pattern that felt almost intelligent. "It's communicating," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. "It's been trying to communicate with us." The idea was ludicrous, and yet it made a chilling sort of sense. The Abyss wasn't just a place, it was a presence, an ancient entity that had been reaching out, pulling them deeper into its grasp. "But what does it want?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why us?" Emily stared at the shifting signal, her mind racing. It had lured them here, using the shipwreck, the shadows, and even her father's image to manipulate them. It was testing them, playing with their fears and desires. But why? "To escape," she said finally, the realization sinking in. "It's been trapped here, imprisoned for eons. It needs us to break the final seal." Holloway shook his head, his face a mask of anger and fear. "You're saying it's using us to free itself, and you want to help it?" "No," Emily shot back. "But we need to understand it. If we know what it wants, we can find a way to stop it." "Or it will destroy us," Holloway growled. "We have to get out of here now." Before Emily could respond, the submersible shuddered violently. The screens flickered and the lights dimmed, casting the cabin into an eerie half-darkness. Outside, the mass of shadows began to coalesce, swirling around the submersible like a storm. "Something's happening," Mark said, his voice cracking. "The signal, it's intensifying." The submersible groaned as if under immense pressure, the metal walls creaking and bending. Emily felt a cold dread settle over her as the darkness outside began to take shape. It wasn't just the cavern anymore, it was the abyss itself, awakening. Through the viewport, they saw it. The shadows formed a colossal entity, a being that defied logic and sanity. It was a writhing mass of tentacles and faces, constantly shifting and merging. Eyes, countless glowing eyes, stared back at them, filled with a malevolent intelligence that pierced through their souls. Emily felt her breath hitch. This was the source, the ancient evil that had lain dormant for eons. The prison of the abyss had not been meant to contain something physical, but something far more insidious. A consciousness that fed on fear and despair. "It's waking up," Sophia gasped, stepping back in horror. "It's been feeding off our fear. That's why it let us come this far." The entity surged forward, its form distorting and expanding until it filled the entire viewport. The submersible rocked, metal shrieking as tendrils of darkness lashed against it. The faces within the entity twisted and screamed, an orchestra of agony that reverberated inside their heads. "Get us out of here," Holloway roared, grabbing the controls. He pushed the thrusters to full power, but the submersible didn't move. The abyss had them in its grasp, an unbreakable hold that tightened with every second. "We need to disrupt the signal again," Emily yelled over the cacophony of noise. "It's using it to control the submersible." Sophia nodded and rushed to the control panel, her hands trembling. She began rerouting the power systems, trying to generate another interference burst. But the entity reacted, the cavern shuddering violently as if it were alive. The tendrils outside slammed into the submersible, denting the hull. Emily stumbled, catching herself on the console. "Hurry!" Sophia worked frantically, sweat pouring down her face. "I'm trying, but it's fighting back. It's like it knows what we're doing." The entity's faces pressed against the glass, mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. Emily felt its presence inside her mind, a cold, invasive force that dug into her memories and fears. It showed her visions, her father's last moments, the terror he felt as he was consumed by the darkness. The abyss had taken him, twisted him, and now it sought to do the same to her. "No," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You won't take me." Emily, the voice echoed, a mixture of her father's and the abyss. Join us. Free us. The lights in the submersible flickered, and the screens went black. For a terrifying moment, they were plunged into absolute darkness. Then a pale blue light filled the cabin, emanating from the abyss outside. It was beautiful and terrible, a cold glow that seeped into their very souls. Emily felt her body go numb, the light drawing her toward the viewport. It whispered to her, promising knowledge, power, and a reunion with her father. All she had to do was let go, to open herself to the abyss. Emily. Holloway's voice was a distant echo. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Don't listen to it. She blinked, the spell breaking. The abyss roared, the faces in the mass outside contorting in rage. It lashed out, tendrils smashing against the submersible with a force that sent them spiraling. Sophia screamed as a console exploded in a shower of sparks. We're losing power. Emily pushed herself to her feet, her mind clearing. They were out of time. The abyss was awake, and it was going to tear them apart piece by piece. Self-destruct, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. We need to destroy the submersible and collapse the cavern. It's the only way. Holloway stared at her, his face a mask of shock. Are you insane? We'll die. If we don't, this thing will escape, Emily shot back. It's been waiting for centuries for someone to free it. We can't let that happen. Sophia looked between them, terror and desperation in her eyes. Emily, are you sure? Emily's gaze hardened. It's either us or the world. We have to stop it here. Holloway cursed, his face twisted with rage and fear, but he knew she was right. They all did. Mark moved to the control panel, his hands shaking. The self-destruct sequence. It'll cause the reactor to go critical and implode. The pressure should collapse the cavern. Do it, Emily said, her voice resolute. Initiate the sequence. As Mark input the commands, the submersible's alarms blared, a final warning. The countdown began, a cold, mechanical voice echoing through the cabin. Self-destruct sequence initiated, T-minus 5 minutes. The abyss outside screamed, a sound that pierced through the hull and into their very minds. The faces in the mass twisted and contorted, the tendrils flailing in a frenzy. It knew what they were doing, and it was furious. Hold on to something, Holloway yelled as the submersible began to shake violently. The abyss was trying to crush them, to stop the destruction it had evaded for so long. Emily grabbed the console, her knuckles white. The entity's voice filled her head, a cacophony of whispers and screams. Emily, please don't do this. It showed her visions of her father, alive and whole, standing before her. His eyes pleaded with her, his hands reaching out. Emily, save us. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. You're not him, she whispered. You're not my father. The entity roared, its faces splitting into grotesque parodies of humanity, their mouths gaping wide in eternal screams. The cavern began to collapse, the walls crumbling as the submersible's reactor reached critical mass. 30 seconds, the mechanical voice droned. Emily opened her eyes, meeting the gaze of the abyss one last time. It stared back at her, its myriad eyes burning with ancient hatred and sorrow. In that moment, she understood its nature. It was not just a monster, it was a prisoner, trapped in its own cycle of suffering and rage, but it was also a danger to everything above. Goodbye, she whispered. The reactor detonated, a blinding flash of light that consumed the submersible. The explosion ripped through the cavern, collapsing it in a cascade of rock and water. The abyss howled, its form disintegrating into the darkness as the ocean crushed it, sealing it away once more. Silence fell, the echoes of the explosion fading into the depths. The trench, the ancient prison, returned to its slumber. Far above, the surface of the ocean remained calm, unbroken. The world continued, unaware of the nightmare that had stirred in the depths. And deep below, in the heart of the abyss, the whispers faded. But they would never truly be gone. The abyss would wait. It always did. A profound silence followed the cataclysmic roar of the explosion, the kind of silence that seeped into the bones and settled there. As the last remnants of the abyssal voyager disintegrated in the crushing embrace of the Mariana Trench, the darkness swallowed everything whole. The cavern had collapsed, sealing the abyss behind a veil of jagged rock and debris, and with it, the horrors that had stirred there. Emily Lawson floated in a void. For a brief, terrible moment, she felt nothing. No pain, no fear, no sense of self. Only an empty, cold expanse that stretched on forever. Was this death? Was she merely another soul caught in the abyss, her essence joining the chorus of whispers that haunted the trench? But then sensation returned, slow and steady like the ebb of a tide. A warmth spread through her, a gentle pull drawing her upward. She gasped, her lungs filling with air, her senses flickering back to life. She opened her eyes, expecting to see darkness, but instead was met with a dim, greenish glow. She was still alive. Somehow, impossibly, she had survived. Emily lay in a small pocket of water surrounded by debris and shattered rock. The reactor's explosion had sealed the cavern, but it had also created this hollow space, a fragile bubble of air deep within the trench. She was alone, or so she thought. "Emily!" The voice was faint, a whisper carried on the currents. She stiffened, every muscle in her body tense. The abyss, it had survived too. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up, her body bruised and battered from the blast. The glow emanated from bioluminescent coral lining the walls, casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted in the watery gloom. She staggered to her feet, her gaze scanning the cavern for the source of the voice. Emily. It was different now, softer, almost pleading. She turned, her breath hitching in her throat. There, in the corner of the cavern, was a figure. It was hazy, its outline shimmering like a mirage, but as it stepped forward, its features became clear. Her father. He stood before her, his eyes gentle but filled with sorrow. His lips moved, but the words that came out were silent, a projection of thought rather than sound. You can't be real," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "This is just another trick." He shook his head slowly. "No, Emily, it's me. I've been trapped here, just like the others, bound to this place." She wanted to believe him, desperately. Her knees trembled as she took a step toward him. "How? How are you here?" He gestured to the cavern around them, the walls pulsating with a faint, almost heart-like rhythm. "This place, it's alive. It holds on to us, uses us, but when you destroyed the submersible, it weakened. I'm free, Emily, but only for a moment." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't understand. I destroyed it. I destroyed the abyss. How can it still hold you?" Her father's face twisted with pain. "The abyss isn't just a place. It's a consciousness, a hunger that transcends time. You sealed it, yes, but you haven't destroyed it. It's only dormant now, waiting for the next opportunity." Emily's heart sank. She had sacrificed everything, her crew, her life, only to learn that the horror she had fought against was merely subdued, not eradicated. Then what was the point? She choked out, anger and despair welling up within her. Why did we go through all of this if it was for nothing? "It wasn't for nothing," he said softly. "You have weakened it, Emily. You have given us a chance, but now you have one final task." She stared at him, searching his face for answers. "What do you mean?" He reached out, his form wavering like smoke in the water. "The final seal, Emily. The abyss can't truly be destroyed, but it can be imprisoned forever. It needs a guardian, someone to keep it in check, to ensure it never awakens again." Her eyes widened, the weight of his words sinking in. No, you're asking me to stay, to become part of it. He nodded, tears glistening in his own eyes. If you don't, it will break free again. Maybe not now, maybe not for centuries, but it will happen, and when it does, the world above will face its wrath. The enormity of the choice crushed her. She had come here to find answers, to find her father, and now she was faced with the same fate that had claimed him. To become a guardian, a warden of this ancient evil, meant condemning herself to an eternity of isolation and darkness. "Isn't there another way?" she pleaded, her voice trembling. He shook his head. "If there was, I would have found it. The abyss feeds on souls, on fear. By staying, you can keep it sated, keep it contained. But only someone who understands it can hold that power." Emily looked into his eyes, seeing the depth of his pain and love. This was his final gift to her, the truth. The choice was hers now, the final act in a long line of sacrifices. She swallowed hard, her mind reeling. Could she do it? Could she give up everything to protect a world that would never know her name, never know the horrors she had faced? "I can't," she whispered. "I'm not strong enough." "You are," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "You are stronger than you know. You have faced the abyss and resisted it. You have the power to seal it away. But the decision must be yours." Emily felt the tears spill over, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. But as she stood there, facing the shimmering image of her father, she realized that this was the truth of their world. Some evils couldn't be defeated, only contained. And sometimes that was enough. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "If I do this, will you stay with me?" His face softened, a bittersweet smile touching his lips. "For as long as I can. But remember, Emily, you won't be alone. You will be the light in the darkness, the final seal that keeps the world safe." A sob escaped her lips, but she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll do it. I'll be the seal." As she spoke the words, the cavern around her seemed to react, the pulsating light intensifying. Her father stepped forward, his form growing more solid, more real. He took her hands in his, a warmth spreading through her cold limbs. "You've made me so proud," he said softly. "Now, close your eyes." Emily closed her eyes, and a wave of calm washed over her. The voices of the abyss murmured at the edges of her consciousness, but they no longer frightened her. They were echoes, lost souls that needed guidance. She would be their guardian now, their warden. A brilliant light burst forth, radiating from her core. It surged outward, filling the cavern, sealing every crack and crevice. She felt the abyss resist, a final surge of anger and defiance, but it was too late. Her light pushed it back, enveloping it in a cocoon of warmth and resolve. The abyss fell silent. Emily opened her eyes. The cavern was no more. She stood in a vast expanse of light and shadow, her father's presence beside her, his hand in hers. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice echoing in the emptiness. "For now," he replied, "and for a long time to come. You have become the final seal, Emily. You are the guardian of the abyss." She nodded, feeling an unexpected peace settle within her. She had done it. She had stopped the abyss from rising again. And though she was alone in this eternal vigil, she knew she had made the right choice. "Thank you," she said, looking at her father, "for everything." He smiled, his form already starting to fade. "You are never truly alone, Emily. Remember that." With those final words, he vanished, leaving her standing in the vast, silent expanse. She took a deep breath and turned toward the shadows, her eyes glowing with the light of her resolve. She was the final seal, and as long as she stood watch, the abyss would remain imprisoned, its whispers silenced, its hunger kept at bay. Far above, the ocean remained tranquil, the world oblivious to the sacrifice made deep within the trench. And somewhere in the quiet depths, where the light could not reach, a lone figure stood vigilant, a guardian of the darkness. For now and for all time, the abyss would wait, but so would she.